Hello. Today I want to present to you the very fascinating and detailed memoirs of a man who experienced the horrors of the Second World War. Manfred Diener, who was born in the distant year of 1927. He grew up in a family where the clearly expressed National Socialist views of the time were supported and cultivated with particular zeal. His father, starting in 1925, took an active part in the activities of the NSDAP party, being an old fighter, hardened in political battles, and the proud owner of a golden party badge, which symbolized his unwavering devotion and loyalty to the ideology that he professed. Manfred's parents owned a small bakery and a cozy shop where they sold various colonial goods, including aromatic tea, invigorating coffee, and a wide range of spices that brought vivid colors and rich flavors to life. Every day, they started their work at an unusual time, at 3 in the morning, to lovingly and carefully start baking fresh and fragrant bread for their customers. At the age of 10, like many of his peers, he became a member of the Young Folk Youth Organization. And then at 14, he moved to the Hitler Youth, an organization that dealt with the ideological, physical, and military training of the young generation, the future soldiers of the Reich. It was not coercion on the part of the authorities, as they sometimes try to present it in our time. It was a completely voluntary decision of each person. However, from the point of view of the moral norms and foundations of society of that time, such participation in youth organizations was considered absolutely necessary and even an honorable thing. Diener emphasizes with a sense of nostalgia. In the Hitler Youth, he received thorough initial military training, where he diligently mastered the skills of shooting from air rifles, then from small-bore rifles, and also practiced throwing training grenades, which carefully imitated real ones, allowing future soldiers to get used to handling weapons. Immediately after successfully completing his studies at school, he was sent to the Imperial SS training camp, which was located in the Czech Republic. There he underwent intensive and extremely harsh military training, intended for future soldiers of elite units who were to fight for Hitler's ideals. The Czech people during the war lived in much better conditions than most of the population of Europe. With the exception of Switzerland, which remained neutral, the Czechs were not drafted into the armed forces. Their cities were not subjected to massive and destructive bombing. They worked mainly in defense industry enterprises, receiving stable high earnings. They also received food supplies in the highest category A, which ensured them a decent standard of living. Heydrich, who, as is known, was eliminated by treacherous Englishmen at the hands of their Czech agents, was eliminated in order to prevent further rapprochement between the Czechs and the Germans and the creation of a united, powerful alliance. Manfred Diener particularly emphasizes. After completing training at the training camp, he was transferred to the Imperial Labor Agency, since only persons who had reached the age of 17 were accepted into the elite SS units. He was assigned to work at a military airfield where, in huge hangars, the refueling and maintenance of military aircraft equipment, which played a key role on the war fronts, was carried out. The supply in the Luftwaffe was organized at the highest level, and all young people who had not yet reached the age of 17 were given an additional food ration as an incentive for their diligent and painstaking work for the benefit of the Reich. I confess honestly, I was excessively frivolous and juvenile conceited until a more experienced soldier, who had extensive combat experience and was awarded a golden badge, had a serious educational conversation with me, which, as they say, straightened out my brains and made me look at life more responsibly, Diener recalls. We ask you to subscribe to our channel, give a like, so that you can hear many more interesting stories about the Second World War and the opinions of all participants about certain events. This was followed by training in the Training Reserve Battalion of the 3rd Panzer Division of the Waffen-SS, which received the ominous nickname Death's Head, where all training and combat training were subject to the strict principle sweat saves blood, frequent and exhausting marches for a distance of 25 kilometers with full combat gear, along with constant, grueling training sessions, were extremely difficult tests of endurance and fortitude for future soldiers who were to face the cruelty of war. We completely lacked the concept of masters. We did not address each other by the form her, as was customary in other Wehrmacht units, but exclusively by military rank, thus emphasizing equality and brotherhood among soldiers. Our comradeship was very strong and reliable. We were like brothers, ready to come to each other's aid at any moment. For stealing from a comrade, a severe punishment immediately followed, namely being sent to a penal company where soldiers were subjected to even more severe tests and grueling training. Also, courage tests were carried out in the unit, which, although voluntary to participate in, were considered extremely prestigious and honorable among the soldiers. Someone who successfully passed all the tests received a special sleeve patch, a thin strip of fabric with a silver death's head embroidered on it, which served as a symbol of valor, bravery, and courage. At that time, young girls were different. They valued courage and bravery, and when a soldier returned home, dressed in a beautiful military uniform and with such a patch on his sleeve, they showed increased interest and admiration for him. I also strongly wanted to get this honorary patch in order to prove my courage and loyalty. Manfred Diener recalls with regret and nostalgia. The courage tests, which in various sources are often described as shooting at each other with live ammunition, in Diener's training battalion included the following very dangerous and risky stages. A jump from a height of 4 meters in full combat gear, which was considered the simplest exercise and was a kind of test for dexterity and fearlessness. Throwing a hand grenade into a trench where another soldier was, who in turn had to throw it as far as possible until it exploded, after which a change of roles followed, representing a dangerous game with death. Independent digging of a trench designed to protect against enemy shells, and being in it at the moment when a combat tank was passing over it, which rumbled and roared over the soldier's head, testing his nerves and psyche. Of course, such tests were not without injuries, and in some tragic cases led to the death of young soldiers, but it did not stop them, and they continued training with persistence as before. Nevertheless, such tests were carried out right up until 1945, when the outcome of the war was already predetermined. Manfred successfully passed this test only on the 3rd attempt, since in the first 2 times he lacked the dexterity and speed to finish digging before the tank approached his trench. He ended up on the front line in Hungary. On the border of 1944 and 1945, he was, so to speak, very lucky, since he was sent to a commandant company, which was engaged in guarding the division headquarters, and not to the advanced units, where the soldiers acted as cannon fodder. Doomed to death in the very first battles, the company had amphibious Schwimmwagen VW TYP 166, produced by the well-known German concern Volkswagen, which were used for the rapid transportation of personnel and various goods necessary to ensure the viability of the headquarters. The crew of each amphibian consisted of 3 people: the driver, the first MG-42 machine gun crewman, and the second crewman, who sat in the back and was responsible for feeding the machine gun belts, ensuring uninterrupted fire. The machine gun was mounted on a special rod that allowed it to fire in any direction, creating a powerful barrage on the battlefield. Manfred performed the duties of the second crewman and was also responsible for the timely supply of food and ammunition, which were carefully stored on the 4th seat, intended for these purposes. During the counteroffensive of Soviet troops, about 20 kilometers from Budapest, they completely ran out of fuel and ammunition, which made their further advance absolutely impossible. The supply units were cut off by the active and successful actions of the advancing Red Army. As a result, they had no choice but to blow up cars and tanks so that they would not fall into the hands of the enemy, since they could not be used for their intended purpose due to an acute shortage of fuel. I confess, I ran away then like a real and miserable coward, trying to save my life. After that, the general retreat of German troops began, which was accompanied by fierce fighting, and gradually turned into a panicked and chaotic flight that engulfed all units. I was very frivolous and distinguished by youthful vanity. I was extremely attracted by the prospect of receiving a close combat badge, which was awarded for participating in 15 close combats with the enemy, in which valor and courage were shown. It should be noted that those soldiers who managed to survive in the first battles, as a rule, also survived later, overcoming all the hardships and horrors of the war, which brought only death and destruction. Diener recalls with sadness and bitterness. During the fifth night battle, Manfred could not cope with his fear and panicked, succumbing to the animal instinct of self-preservation. They went into an attack as part of an assault group of 20 people, who, like the doomed, were supposed to break through the enemy's line of defense. An experienced and battle-hardened soldier who had many battles behind him and was awarded a Golden Party badge, to whom Diener simply told about his father, who had the same award, said seriously and with a certain degree of sympathy, "Manfred, we will all without exception die in this attack. Try to save your life. Don't rush forward like a madman, hoping for a miracle." As it turned out later, his words were absolutely prophetic and carried a bitter truth. Of the entire assault group that went into the last battle, only 3 people survived, who miraculously survived. It was indescribably terrible. It's simply impossible to put into words how terrible and monstrous everything was. I ran like a madman, knocking everything down in my path and experiencing an unbearable feeling of shame and humiliation. I managed to hide in a relatively safe place and thus got my next close combat without showing the slightest heroism. On March 16th, Soviet troops were able to turn the tide on the front and began a large-scale offensive, after which the German army in Hungary carried out only a hasty and disorderly retreat, suffering huge losses in manpower and equipment. We must honestly admit that the Hungarian population during the war lived much more prosperously than we Germans. Diener shares his observation. We were strictly forbidden to enter any premises with food, under the threat of immediate and brutal execution for looting. So we were afraid to do this and sent our Hiwis, locals who cooperated with the German occupation authorities for such actions, while the Russian soldiers took everything they needed without bothering much and without asking anyone for permission. The situation was becoming more and more critical and hopeless. The retreat quickly turned into a panic flight, and the flight into a mass roundup, which in the end turned into the beating of German soldiers by superior enemy forces. What will you do when the Russians come? At some fateful moment, which could have been his last, Diener suffered a serious wound from a shrapnel from an enemy 76mm Ratchboom shell, as German soldiers called the 76mm Zis 3 cannon, because of the characteristic sound of the shot and explosion, which occurred almost simultaneously. After receiving first medical aid, Manfred made a desperate attempt to jump into the back of a passing truck, but the Hungarian soldiers there began to push him away with their rifle butts, since he was a German soldier whom they did not like. They betrayed us, these people, and now they were hastily fleeing with an entire division, suffering losses and leaving their yesterday's allies to their fate. After this humiliating incident, he was forced to walk on foot along with the retreating train, experiencing extreme exhaustion and feeling the approach of inevitable death. In occupied Vienna, he witnessed the destruction of the latest Me-262, the first jet aircraft in the world, which were a great rarity and a real technological breakthrough in aviation at that time. Due to the critical shortage of fuel, the planes had to be blown up so that they would not fall into the hands of the advancing enemy and become trophies. Another horrifying and tragic episode deeply shocked the 17-year-old boy, forcing him to reconsider his values and views on the ongoing war. Propagandists in Vienna persistently spread information among the female population that they should do everything possible to avoid being mistaken for women, explained how to dress in rags, smear their faces with dirt, and try to look as much like men as possible in order to avoid violence and abuse. And to the question, what will you do when the Russians come? One Hungarian woman replied with cynical frankness and without a trace of embarrassment, "Well, "We will not resist," which essentially meant that they were ready to give themselves up to the will of the victors. Young Manfred Diener was simply shocked by this cynical and frank answer, which he could not comprehend. North of Vienna, not far from the Imperial Bridge, Diener was seriously wounded in the head and, completely exhausted, lay on the side of the road, waiting for his sad and tragic fate. But a Russian soldier, seeing him, uttered heartfelt words full of compassion. "Oh God, a very young man," spared him and did not finish him off, showing mercy. However, he himself soon fell a hero's death, struck by a machine gun burst and falling on the battlefield. These words were forever etched in Diener's memory, and he carried them through his long life, remembering that tragic day. After that, there was a military hospital where he received qualified medical care. He was, so to speak, very lucky that he managed to survive the hell he had to go through. Then he made a desperate attempt to surrender to American troops, hoping that this would be the best option for him. An American colonel assured the captured German soldiers that the war was over for them and that they would soon be sent to a special camp for demobilized soldiers in Munich via the Austrian city of Linz, where they could return to a peaceful life. This promise, as it soon turned out, was a cynical and deceitful deception, which caused a feeling of resentment and disappointment among the German soldiers. Marching columns were formed. At the head of the column rode an American tank. Then came 500 captured soldiers, built in rows of 5, and then again an American tank, closing the column. They first marched strictly west, then their path turned north, and suddenly, at a fork in the road, their path sharply turned east. Then the German soldiers realized with horror that they were being deceitfully led into captivity by Soviet troops, whom they disliked and feared. The column that was marching in front of Diener's column, when approaching a dense forest, suddenly rushed into it, trying to save their lives in this way. They simply didn't know that the Americans had prepositioned machine guns and automatic riflemen in the forest, waiting for the right moment. Those unfortunates who tried to hide in the forest were doomed to die. Only about half of the people came back from there. All these people are still listed as missing. Their fate remains unknown to this day. But I myself witnessed this whole nightmare. I saw everything with my own eyes. Manfred Diener recalls with horror and bitterness. In captivity, I quite quickly and deftly became an organizer of barter exchange, which allowed me to survive in difficult conditions. When they were delivered to the Russians, the first thing they did was roughly take away everyone's watches and rings, which represented some value and could be used for exchange. They also took away good and high-quality shoes, replacing them with old, worn-out, and completely unsuitable Russian boots, causing outrage and discontent among the prisoners. Then all the Highwiss, locals who had cooperated with the German army, were taken out of the crowd. During the march, columns of German prisoners of war were brutally attacked by former prisoners of the Mauthausen concentration camp, who sought to take revenge on those who wore SS uniforms, carrying with them revenge and the desire to take revenge for the suffering and torment they had endured. I was walking on the edge of the column, and a former concentration camp prisoner also rushed at me, but a Russian mounted patrol, fortunately, saved me from certain and brutal death. Manfred Diener gratefully recalls, while passing through Czech territory, local women, seeing how the prisoners were suffering from thirst and exhaustion, did not pity them, pouring water directly under their feet. Later, the prisoners were hardly guarded at all, as they were exhausted to the limit and no longer posed any real threat, having turned into living shadows of themselves. In captivity, Manfred Diener was initially engaged in logging in the harsh and merciless region of the Urals. Then he participated in the construction of a canal in the Kuban region, and later worked in a quarry in Stavropol, where he also participated in the construction of difficult roads that required enormous efforts before the arrival of the next commission, which checked the conditions of detention of the prisoners. The walls of the barracks were painted white, and for 3 days the canteen provided improved and more varied food, In Diener's brigade, he quite quickly and deftly became an organizer who was able to obtain flour, potatoes, dried fruits, and anything else that could be found from the local population in order to somehow improve the meager diet and the situation of his comrades. For this, he had to supply the escorts with vodka or moonshine, playing the role of an intermediary between the prisoners and the outside world. The situation reached the point that, when all the nearby villages had already been processed, he began to hitchhike and travel to remote villages located 30 to 40 kilometers from the camp, risking being caught and punished. In Europe, if someone votes on the road, no one will stop. They will pass by without paying the slightest attention. Never. But in Russia, strangely enough, everyone always stopped, ready to help. Once I was taken by a Russian police captain. He asked me honestly, "German?" I answered honestly, yes. Manfred recalls with surprise and bewilderment. He also picked me up on the way back, took me back to the camp, and even gave the watchman a bottle of vodka so that he wouldn't beat and harass me. It was truly amazing and astounding. Then he was in a camp in Kazakhstan. There he was lucky again, as he was assigned to work in a slaughterhouse, where he was engaged in slaughtering and butchering sheep and cattle, turning animals into meat for feeding prisoners and guards. Meat theft was strictly prohibited and punishable by a severe penalty, which entailed an additional penalty of 2 years in prison, which significantly complicated the lives of prisoners. But they still managed to steal, showing ingenuity and inventiveness, hiding pieces of meat under their clothes or in their pants by the end of the shift, risking being caught and brutally punished. At one fine and long-awaited moment, a long-awaited order was received to send home all prisoners of war who were not recognized as war criminals by December 31st. Manfred Diener returned to his home in Germany and until 1990 lived, trying not to attract too much attention to himself and not publicizing his past, and never publicly mentioned his service in the sinister SS Division Death's Head. Only in 1990 did he decide to place an advertisement in the newspaper in order to search for his former comrades from the 3rd SS Panzer Division Death's Head, hoping in this way to find those who were still alive after the horrors of that terrible war. Only 5 people responded to his advertisement, from those who miraculously survived after the battles, from those who managed to escape death in that hell. Goodbye. We were glad to see you on our channel. Don't forget to write comments. Give a like and subscribe to the channel.